Before I even start, I want to say that to put you in the frame of reference for the Battle of Britain, that since the Second World War, we have been accustomed to smallish wars in faraway places with not all that much at stake. It is possible to feel ambivalent about those wars. People felt ambivalent about the Korean War. Indeed, Ike felt ambivalent about it. People felt ambivalent, and more than that, about the war in Vietnam. And that was quite understandable and permissible. Even today, it is possible to have extreme doubt as to whether we should really be fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, and there's nothing wrong with holding that opinion. The war that I am about to address here is not that kind of war. This was a war in which existence, in which life, in which national survival depended upon victory, in which there was no possibility of surrender, no possibility of negotiation, no possibility of ambivalence. In May of 1940, the Germans were there, 21 miles across the Channel. When Winston Churchill was told, as the French army began to fall back and collapse, that the French were not sure what they were fighting for, he famously replied, "They will be very sure what they were fighting for once they have surrendered." And he was right. So, the Second World War is that kind of war. I've always been interested myself in the Battle of Britain, not surprisingly, since a good deal of it took place over my head when I was a child in England, age 7. And I knew a lot of people who fought in it then and later on when I was grown up. It was no accident that when it came time to do my national service at the age of 17 and a half, I joined the Royal Air Force myself. You didn't get a choice, of course, but I begged my father and his friend Brendan Bracken, a member of Parliament and one of Churchill's closest friends and advisors, to get me somehow into the RAF. My father, who had served in the Austro-Hungarian infantry in World War I on the Carpathian Front, was willing enough to do anything which would keep me out of the army and the trenches, both of which he himself had disliked very much indeed. So numerous air marshals were called and taken to lunch at Prunier's on my behalf, and I ended up spending 2 years in the Royal Air Force, quite happy ones looking back on it. To this day, I get a thrill just looking at an aircraft close up or from shading my eyes and looking at one high in the sky and trying to decide what it is. We live in Dutchess County, Margaret and I, in New York, and from time to time we get a big Air Force C-5A flying over our farm, lowering its wheels and flaps to land at Stewart Field outside Newburgh, and I'm always awed by its sheer size and majesty. Getting close to airplanes I like even better. There's something about the smell of aviation fuel, burned rubber, and hot metal that I still find exciting 58 years after hanging around airplanes while my father and David Lean made The Sound Barrier with Ann Todd and Ralph Richardson, the year I joined the RAF. I managed then to cage a ride in the de Havilland Comet, the first jet-powered airliner, and in the back seat of a Supermarine Swift jet fighter, and I can still remember and relish every moment. In those days, 1951, it had only been 11 years since the Battle of Britain, and the RAF was still full of people who had experienced it at first hand, whether as aircrew or on the ground. There was a Polish flight lieutenant at my recruit training depot with most of his face burned off, his burned hands covered with black cotton gloves, who had won a DSO and a DFC flying Spitfires and wore the small gold bar with the words Battle of Britain engraved on the ribbon of his 1939-1945 service star. I cannot tell you how much we hero worshipped him. Some of the older NCOs and warrant officers had been air gunners towards the end of the war. Jaunty phrases from the unique slang of the wartime Royal Air Force were still in unself-conscious daily use. Bloody good show, piece of cake, bang on, wizard prang, tail end Charlie. Aircraftmen were irks, to wait was to stooge about. Duff gen was bad information, while pucka gen was the real thing. Blast off meant fed up. A kite was an airplane. Press the tit was the command to hurry up. The Brill Cream boys, named after the famous brand of men's hair cream, were us, of course, members of the RAF, the mob, as opposed to blue jobs, the Navy, and brown jobs, the Army. So I began early on reading whatever I could about the battle and talking to those who had fought in it on both sides, for the RAF eventually sent me to Germany. I read Richard Hillary's classic book about his experience as a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, The Last Enemy, with close attention because he was reputed to have been a lover of my Auntie Merle's, despite the fact that he was a guinea pig, a patient of the legendary Dr. McEnroe of the Queen Victoria Burns Institute at East Grinstead, the plastic surgeon who specialized in those airmen whose face had been burned off when their plane caught fire, always referred to as guinea pigs, both because the endless painful surgery was experimental and because their faces, even when rebuilt, were smooth and hairless with no lips and vestigial nose and ears. Hillary, a charismatic, handsome, and intellectual undergraduate at Trinity College, Oxford, had joined the RAF, shot down 5 Germans, then hit himself, parachuted from his burning Spitfire, losing his nose, his lips, his ears, and most of the flesh off his hands. And it always fascinated me that he may have found a brief period of happiness with my exquisitely glamorous, beautiful, and fastidious Admiral Oberon before going back to flying duties and getting killed in 1943. I met and became a friend of the ace Peter Townsend, Group Captain Peter Townsend, DSO, DFC, and BAR, who nearly married Princess Margaret but was prevented from doing so because of his divorce, and who was one of the most glamorous survivors of the Battle of Britain. And I also met the remarkable Group Captain Douglas Bader, CBE, DSO and BAR, DFC and BAR, the legless ace who shot down 22 German aircraft. I read everything I could about the Battle of Britain and even wangled my way up in a Spitfire, converted into a 2-seat trainer for the Irish Air Force after the war, just to hear the snarl of the famous 12-cylinder, 27-liter Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, to give you some sense of how big that is. The biggest car engine today in a BMW or Mercedes-Benz is 6 liters. And to feel what it was like to fly in that small, sensitive, graceful aircraft which inspired Pilot Officer Philip McGee in High Flight to write, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up in the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high and trespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." There is a beauty and poetry to airplanes and to flying, but the Battle of Britain was a battle with all that that entails: suffering, heroism, tragic mistakes, death. Pilot Officer Philip McGee, the young poet I have just quoted, was killed in the air at the age of 21, a brilliant talent snuffed out in his youth like so many of the First World War poets. For all the romantic, devil-may-care glamour of fighter pilots, when we see them in the old photographs, many of them, most of them, were dead before they reached 21.